Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest in our NFM webinar series. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hear you loud and clear, thank you.
Thank you, great, good, thank you. Yeah, so I can hear entry and exit tones. Can other people hear those? I'll try and turn those off shortly, but sorry that's distracting. So the webinar series, it's the latest in our program, and our aim is to help researchers and practitioners share knowledge and experience in NFM. And today we're really pleased that we've got Chris.
You're muted, Gerald. Jared.
Jared, you're muted.
Gerald, you're muted. No one can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
Can, yeah.
Great, sorry about that. Right. Yeah, so we're very pleased today that we've got Chris Uttley from the Environment Agency, you just heard, who he's a senior advisor on flood and coastal risk management, and he's going to present to us today on getting the most for nature-based flood and coastal risk reduction from ELMs, so that's environmental land management schemes, and how this might work. Hi, I'm Gerard Stewart. I'm the communications coordinator for the NFM research program. And just before we move on, there's a couple of housekeeping issues. Please keep your microphones muted to avoid background noise. Please do ask questions. Please use the chat function to do that. You can see the speech bubble there to enable you to do that. And in previous webinars, we've had quite lively discussions on the chat. So yeah, please do use that. And we're also very pleased that we've got Caroline Essery, a colleague of Chris's, who will be endeavouring to answer questions as the webinar progresses. There will be time for questions at the end, so we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions. And also the webinar is going to be it is being recorded, and it will be available on our website in the next couple of days. Just a little bit about the research programme itself. It's a 4-year, £4 million research programme. We're carrying out novel science to improve our understanding. So we're getting some background noise there. Could you please mute your microphones? So we're carrying out novel science to improve the understanding of natural flood management using quantitative and collaborative approaches. And we're looking at a range of NFM measures in different types of catchments, flooding scenarios, and at different scales. And our aim is to improve evidence and understanding for policymakers and practitioners. There's 3 projects that make up the programme, and you can find out more about those and our research more generally on our website. A key part of the research is working with partners, and today is an example of that. One of our most important partners is the Environment Agency. So Chris isn't going to be talking about the research that we're carrying out as such, but clearly a lot of links. But one of the aims of the webinar programme is to provide a platform and really help to try and build a community of people involved in natural flood risk management. Okay, so I'll now hand over to Chris. Over to you, Chris.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, Chris, I can hear you. Good.
Okay, and the slides are showing well on the screen, I hope.
Yes. Yes, can see your slides.
Fantastic. So, hello, everyone. I'm, as Jared said, I work in the Environment Agency. I'm senior advisor in the National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management team, in a small team that's based focused on working on nature-based solutions and natural flood management and catchment approaches to reducing risk, with hopefully a range of other environmental outcomes alongside the flood risk ones. I'm currently leading our work inputting to the flood risk side of ELMs as part of the Environment Agency's wider effort to advise on the design and development of ELMs with DEFRA. So prior to joining the EA, where some of you may have come across me before, I spent 4 years working at the practical end of natural flood management for Stroud District Council, talking to farmers and woodland owners, seeing what works for them. And so now I'm endeavouring to apply that practical knowledge, blend it with new research, and hopefully provide technical and policy advice to DEFRA to help develop the scheme. So the aim of today's talk is to provide this quick introduction to some of the practicalities for how ELM might be able to contribute to reducing flood risk and our current thinking on some of this. Flood risk is often cited. Those of you who watch the pronouncements on Agriculture Bill and ELMs, well, flood risk is often cited as one of those public goods that ELMs will supply. In fact, it's more commonly cited than any of the other public goods. But obviously that won't happen on its own. We need to work hard to develop a sophisticated understanding of how land management and land use interact with flood risk, looking at the different types of risk, who and where the populations are that are most at risk, and not forgetting, of course, that many farms themselves are at flood risk, and ELMs could be one of the policy mechanisms, one of the vehicles to help those farms adapt and change their business models so that they become more resilient for future climate change, but at the same time helping to reduce risk to our villages, towns and infrastructure. So the talk will cover very brief introductions to some of the policy framework and the evidence base, looking at the types of actions that we are advising are needed to implement ELM or to achieve our flood risk outcomes in ELM. Looking at spatial priorities, how will we determine where is the most effective place to put in place activity? A brief look at how we might measure effectiveness and payments and the advice and guidance that we feel might be needed to give it to achieve the flood risk outcomes. I also want to touch on looking at the funding, how blended funding, so how ELMs might work with flood granting aid and with other sorts of flood risk funding, such as local levy. And then just touch upon some of the lessons from some of the existing projects and my own previous work in Stroud. So I saw this morning that ELMs is in the news again, and the agricultural bill is nearing its completion through Parliament. And of course, it's being described as the opportunity to address multiple environmental impacts and some of the perverse outcomes of the common agricultural policy. It's this transition away from basic payments to payment for public goods. And I think this is one of the kind of big take-home messages, that the ELMs isn't simply another, or shouldn't simply be another, niche agri-environment scheme reaching only 5 or so % of our farmers and landowners. This will be the main source of funding and income for every farmer and landowner, as well as, or complementary to, the income they produce from producing food. So it is incredibly important, and everything that we do on land as a government agency or as other parts of the kind of wider ecosystem of organisations will have to take into account what is happening through ELMs. And potentially, as you see there, £2 to £3 billion per annum available, but obviously that's a movable feast and will depend upon what's happening in Parliament. And on the flood risk policy side, we've just published a new national flood risk strategy that contains a range of measures and objectives that link the Environment Agency's work and the work of other risk management authorities, so lead local flood authorities, to some of the main policy objectives. And these are things like mainstreaming nature-based solutions, so working to mainstream natural flood management, so it's a tool of choice alongside all the other ways that we've got to reduce risk. Working with farmers and landowners to help them reduce flood risk, both to themselves, but also to towns and villages and other parts of infrastructure. And one of the elements of the national strategy was a measure to work with farmers and landowners, particularly in low-lying areas like the fens and levels, those areas that require large-scale interventions, such as pumped drainage and flood embankments or coastal defences, and to look at how those places might need to adapt to this kind of wetter and drier world that we'll find ourselves in as climate change really starts to bite. And of course, it contains some measures about the development and implementation of ELMs, and some of the other policy mechanisms are going to be coming through the Environment Bill, net biodiversity gain and nature recovery being some of the key ones. So I thought, obviously this is a NERC-based webinar, I ought to do a quick review of the evidence available, probably not as in-depth as people would like, but there are a number of meta-studies that have brought together existing evidence, such as the Oxford Martin Restatement, the Environment Agency's own evidence directory. But what they show is that slow the flow techniques can be effective for the type of lower magnitude, higher frequency events in smaller catchments. So properties in smaller catchments at high to high moderate risk of fluvial and surface flooding. We know that many actions and techniques can really benefit those types of properties, those types of risk in these smaller catchments. So very effective, can be very effective for surface and so-called muddy floods and runoff events. And size of catchment is an interesting one, and sometimes that's misinterpreted, I feel. And we're talking about operational catchment here, so size of catchment upstream of the receptors, the properties at risk. So that does not mean slow the flow cannot work in the Severn catchment. It means it will probably work in places within the Severn catchment that have some of those smaller upstream catchments above some of the towns and villages, as opposed to maybe reducing risk in places like Shrewsbury and Gloucester. So the evidence is very much about where and the scale of activity, so how much to do, where to do it, rather than can it work at this level. The evidence for co-benefits, so benefits for nature, benefits for water quality and carbon, from a lot of these techniques is extremely good. Hence the wide interest in natural field management we see from across a wide range of organisations and environmental NGOs and other people within the academic world. Evidence for flood storage and techniques such as coastal realignment and coastal habitat creation is also very good. We know that large-scale storage areas, large-scale moving of coastal defences are good strategies and good techniques for reducing risk, to the point where beaches, sand dunes and salt marsh are fully recognised as coastal defence assets, and they're already part of the country's defences. So what type of actions are we looking at for ELM? And just pausing for a moment to reflect on that evidence base and to put that into the perspective of land management and hydrology. So we know we can reduce rate of runoff and therefore hopefully floods by increasing the roughness, creating rougher vegetation in preferential flow routes. We know we can reduce risk and runoff by increasing losses through evapotranspiration or infiltration, or by attenuating or storing waters temporarily for release later in the flood cycle. So I want to focus in more detail on the types of actions that we've been working with DEFRA to input into the ELM scheme that will affect these hydrological processes. And it's worth remembering that, of course, the environmental outcomes we're working with aren't simply about reducing flood risk. The outcomes of reduced impact and enhanced resilience to flooding, which acknowledges that land management and land use rarely reduce risk fundamentally on their own, but can really contribute to that kind of greater or lesser extent, depending upon the location or circumstance. Resilience can be interpreted in a number of ways, and in this context, I think we're taking it to mean making a contribution to longer term benefits. So not making a situation worse and decreasing the number of events that really cause those problems. So we know we need to relate our actions to their impact on hydrology. But what I want to do is to set out another way of cutting up the NFM cake. And our evidence directory and the other published materials tend to focus very much on discrete actions and their impact on the hydrology. But in our kind of thinking and advice on ELMs, we've thought of a slightly different way of chopping up these actions that relate not only to the hydrology, but also to the actors or the organisations responsible, and also importantly to the budgets that are available to implement those types of natural field management. And once I've been through the kind of rationale for it, hopefully you'll agree that it's a sensible way of looking at NFM actions, especially when we want to refer to ELMs. So we started to think about NFM in the terms of 4 broad packages. So the first, and from some perspectives the most important, because it addresses the nature crises directly, as well as flood risk, is what we've broadly called the kind of landscape scale restoration of nature. And this is what people are often referring to when discussing nature-based solutions. It can clearly cover a wide range of works, from peatland restoration, woodland creation, rewilding, natural colonisation of farmland by scrub and trees. And we know that doing this at this landscape scale will influence the hydrology by increasing roughness or infiltration and evapotranspiration. It might also include making space for these fellas. Beavers were granted a licence to remain on the 6th of August, and the Environment Minister, Rebecca Powell, said that in the future they should be considered a public good. Farmers and landowners might be paid to have them on their land. So that was a quote from the BBC, and she describes beavers as a natural management tool for which farmers could potentially be paid under the new subsidy system. So clearly, I don't think we'd be expecting to see farmers paid directly to have beavers in the same way no one's paid directly to have otters or foxes or other elements of wildlife. But certainly the ecosystem changes that beavers make in the landscape will certainly form part of the kind of wider scope of activity that we might want to see under this kind of broad package of headings around landscape scale restoration of nature. The second sort of package that we've been working on is what we might euphemistically call farming. The changes to farming practice and land management, such as changes to farm husbandry, livestock management, crops, or tillage techniques that increase infiltration or reduce soil erosion. So fundamentally, changes on the factory floor of the vast majority of farms. And lots of ways are means of trying to do this, and lots of attempts to categorize or label different production techniques that reduce their impacts on runoff or hydrology. And there's a huge wealth of practical advice on how to test soil health and what that might mean for farm productivity, but also importantly, what that will mean for runoff and hydrology. The third package, or the type, is what most people are talking about when we talk about natural flood management. What we might call adding lumps and bumps to the landscape, or because this is an ERC seminar, we could describe it as increasing the topographical heterogeneity and complexity of the landscape by the addition of these small scale capital changes. Lots of ways of doing this, and the most effective clearly are about influencing flows, making flood risk changes within ephemeral and permanent flow pathways. I think someone's just forgotten to mute themselves in the background there. If everyone could do that, please, that'd be great. This includes our kind of old, long-standing friend and ally in the natural flood management world, the leaky woody structure. So as part of our work on ELMs, I've been writing the guidance on this action to clarify its use and to differentiate it from some of the other similar actions, such as check dams. So we've called this action creating and managing leaky woody structures in small water courses and their floodplains. And the guidance that we've been working on contains not only kind of practical ways and designs for these sorts of structures, but also a requirement for an ongoing inspection and management regime and the replacement plan, with good record keeping at the heart of that, describing what has been constructed and where. And just to go into a little bit of detail around this, some of the principles that we've kind of brought across from lots of projects, including the work in Stroud, around using wood, particularly leaky woody structures within channels, we have attempted to build into our ELMs guidance. So the use of wood to increase hydraulic roughness and add channel diversity and slow flows, not to maximize storage. The principle of creating lots of different types of structures that perform different roles. So a wide variety of structures that can increase habitat diversity, increase the kind of geomorphological complexity, and provide attenuation. And also this kind of intrinsic link between the size of structures and safety. So trying to lead people, lead whoever will be doing this through ELM schemes, to think about bigger structures and the relationship between risk and the size of the types of material that they've been using. So for preference, I'd like to see more of the type of structures that we were developing in Stroud around the landscape. So these are some of our kind of wilder structures, but equally, I'm also a realist, so I'm not expecting all structures to be built on the lines of these ones here. However, if we're looking at a scheme that delivers a wide range of environmental outcomes, so nature recovery, water quality improvements, as well as flood risk and other types of objectives, then we need to be thinking slightly broader about the types of structures and the types of things we're putting in place for our natural flood management work. The fourth and final type of package is what Paul Quinn at Newcastle or others might call NFM Max or NFM Plus. So these are significant interventions that create these permanent features in the landscape or permanent land use change, but often requires significant engineering expertise to create. So that's the key difference between this type of work and this first package that I talked about, this kind of landscape scale restoration of nature. This type of activity often requires significant investment in engineering, and it's often very expensive. And so its use has to be applied selectively in places where we think we can really make a big difference to flood risk. So examples might be floodplain reconnection, floodplain storage, or creation of washlands. So things that are not really aimed at slow the flow techniques, but much more effective further down our systems. So we could go even further and say that in an ideal world, when we're looking at NFM opportunities on farms, we might want to think about those four packages as a type of a process diagram or a hierarchy of action. So first, we might look at the opportunity for what we might call proper nature-based solutions, habitat creation, restoration. And once we've exhausted those opportunities or decided they are non-available because of constraints on the farm, then think about the changes to farming practice or management to reduce runoff and increase infiltration. Recognizing, of course, that it's often harder to do this because we're at the business end of the farm. Once we've thought about or implemented those sorts of changes, then look at these slightly easier opportunities for small-scale capital works, our topographical changes. And these are often the go-to actions for a very good reason. They can be located outside these main areas of production and are easy and obvious to locate and build upon. So they lend themselves really well to the type of minor flood works that often are associated with natural flood management, and a point I'll come on to later. Clearly, though, once we move on to these bigger items, we need much more expertise and more careful planning and execution, so bigger budgets required and maybe less opportunity for some of those. How will these fit into our kind of design that we know about? So we know there'll be 3 tiers, and the current proposal is based around these 3 tiers, where tier 1 framed around basic universal public goods. So things like protection of soils, basic changes to husbandry or tillage. Tier 2 will focus on these more complex and targeted public goods. So that's where we anticipate the majority of targeted NFM will be sourced and take place within that second tier. So a key scheme for implementing these small scale capital works and topographical changes. And then tier 3, which is currently aimed at landscape scale land use choices, is where we'd be expecting to see broad scale woodland creation and peatland restoration and nature recovery. So that's where the nature-based solutions elements will be focused in our view. So just moving on then to from actions to where might we undertake these works, and how will we prioritise or target our investment. A key aspect of reducing flood risk is making sure that our activity and energy is focused in the right place. So where are the people and the properties who can benefit most from the actions that reduce the type of risk NFM is good at reducing? And this is where there is a bit of a change in focus. So simply focusing on opportunity won't guarantee or be good enough to ensure that we're achieving these maximum public goods. So we need to prioritise the places where the approach can produce the most public good. We don't know yet within the ELMs scheme whether spatial prioritisation will be driven by national priorities or by local choices, or a combination of both. But in either scenario, we need to get our house in order, so to speak, so that we can go into those discussions with a good idea of where we want to prioritise and focus natural flood management work. So in the Environment Agency, we envisage a suite of spatial priorities or mapping systems for flood risk reduction in ELMs. And I've set them out on this diagram here. So what most people think of as NFM when they talk about NFM is slowing the flow. And we know from the evidence base that I touched on earlier that these types of measures are going to work best where people or properties are at those higher risk ends of frequent but lower magnitude floods in these smaller rural catchments. So we've developed a simple system to identify, find higher levels of properties at those higher risk ends in these smaller rural catchments. And what you can see here on this slide is the map of Yorkshire that's produced from that type of analysis or algorithm. So we've ranked every water body in Yorkshire, and the red and the orange are showing where we've got large clusters of properties at those higher risk ends in the smaller catchments that are built up into slightly larger catchments. So so you can see here that it's telling us that slow the flow techniques might be most effective in the kind of West and South Yorkshire catchments that run off the Pennines and flow into those large centres of populations that are at quite high risk. Whereas slow the flow techniques may not be so effective at reducing some of the risk in this kind of broad centre of the Yorkshire Dales and the North Yorkshire Moors. However, based upon opportunity mapping, of course, large parts of the Dales and the Moors provide fantastic opportunity to slow the flow. But that may not be where we're going to see the most effective investment within ELMs, because our population numbers are much smaller. So I would not suggesting that you just forget about those areas, because of course this is just a sample of a prioritisation based upon slow the flow. We also need to prioritise places and catchments where larger scale floodplain restoration or floodplain storage or new washlands might reduce risk. We think we need a prioritisation for coastal works. Where could coastal realignment or habitat creation overlap with shoreline management planning policy? We also need some sort of focused prioritisation where we want to see long-term changes to water level management that might blend with activity to improve the water resource situation, for instance, in the fens. So we're talking about 4 types of spatial prioritisation. All this work is still ongoing and still being kind of developed and ground truth, but I thought it'd just give you an idea of where the thinking is going. Another key consideration for us is the type of advice and guidance that will be needed to secure the benefits. So we know currently that the vast majority of NFM in the landscape has either been constructed by farmers, landowners themselves, or by agricultural contractors, or by third parties, the vast majority of which would be by environmental NGOs. So this means that any advice and guidance products or documents need to be tailored to those audiences. So Looking first at guidance, there is a lot of existing guidance already out there, and that, of course, will all be taken into account. But we know that we're going to be needing specific guidance on this range of actions that reduce flood risk, and the Environment Agency is working with Natural England and the Forestry Commission, commissioned by DEFRA, to try to produce some of the technical content for that. We also know that we're going to want to maximise some of the flood risk and coastal erosion risk outcomes from some other actions. So from those actions that are focused on nature or wetlands or soil. So influencing the shape and the content of those guidance documents will also be key. And we want to link and learn from existing work, such as the Syria SUDS manual, or there is a piece of work that Syria are undertaking at the minute. That's the Construction Industry Specialist Research Institute. They've been commissioned to create a manual to provide some kind of design frameworks for some NFM features. And we know that we'll be able to link to some of that work as well. And advice, as I said, this is going to be crucial to ensuring the success of ELMs, irrespective of whether we're looking at flood risk outcomes. And the types of work that we're putting together, focused on packages for training farm advisors, looking at direct technical advice, so who will be deciding where things should go, what should be put where, and more importantly, deciding where things shouldn't go in case there's a potential to increase risk, particularly for some of those larger scale measures. And looking at how we will kind of gear up to provide specialist bespoke advice for some of these more complex, larger scale types of engineering activity. So I want to return to the 4 types of packages of NFM that I talked about earlier, and look at the thorny issue of what will ELM pay for, or could it pay for, and how will it work alongside existing funding mechanisms. So there's a lot of detail on this slide, and I want to stress that this is an informed view. This is how we're developing our thinking rather than final policy, so to speak. But hopefully you can see some sense in brigading our natural flood management types within these 4 broad areas. I've often heard, since I came into the EA, and when I worked in Stroud, people say that they find it difficult to get funding for natural flood management. But quite a lot of that sometimes stems from not understanding that different types of funding or different types of organisations are more relevant for different types of work. So each of these 4 packages that you can see here has a different funding regime, different regulatory requirements, and understanding those will be key to unlocking whether or not and how ELMs will contribute to that type of activity. Whether or not it will rely upon blended finance with flood granting aid, such as these large-scale engineered approaches, or whether we can use flood granting aid to incentivise changes in farm practice. So the kind of clear view on that is it is very difficult to bring flood granting aid to bear to pay for changes to soil management. The funding and the rules around it are just simply not designed or geared up to do that. So ELMs will be crucial in unlocking some of that kind of farming-based activity. It's also going to be crucial in unlocking what many people feel is missing from NFM, which is the maintenance and the land management aspect of any capital works that are put in place. Because of course, we'll be able to create a management system and a routine maintenance system for many of these minor capital works, which could be game-changing as far as ensuring the longevity of structures in the landscape. Another key consideration is how we might reward farmers and land managers who put in place NFM? Is there a way we can link payments to a farmer with reduction in flood risk? And in simple terms, I think my view on that is no. I don't think we should waste our time trying to calculate the exact contribution that any individual farm makes to reducing flood risk. It would be far too complex. We wouldn't be expecting a single farmer to solve water quality or restore biodiversity, and we probably wouldn't be measuring the contribution those single farmers make, because whole ranges of public goods will only come about by the cumulative benefit of lots of individual actions, and flood risk is the same. What we do need, however, is to create a system of recording interventions and proxy payments for effectiveness, such as the ones that have been developed by the catchment-based approach, catchment partnerships that I've been working with, to record areas of roughness that have been changed or created, or volumes of attenuation, or area over which we've increased permeability or interception. So broad scale proxies that will allow us to link farm-based activity to changes in hydrology with some assumptions behind those about how those accumulate to drive changes in flood risk. So some of the risks around this, just to kind of come to the end of the slides on ELMs. We don't know how long funding will last, or the sustainability of funding. Moving from CAP to domestic decision making brings with it some benefits, but it also brings with it a bit more uncertainty from Parliament to Parliament about the budgets that will be in place. I've touched upon these trade-offs between ELMs and other funds, flood granting aid being the key one. It's difficult to take into account those long-term climate impacts to agricultural land and productivity, and how those may play into the development of ELMs in the future. And we might start to see, until ELMs becomes kind of solidified in the landscape, some reluctance from farmers and landowners to contribute to NFM or flood risk schemes before ELMs gets going. And I've outlined some of the challenges that we've got there. So I want to turn just very briefly to some of the key lessons that we learned from other work, and in which respect NFM funded by ELMs should be or would be no different. So how do we involve the people who are having the NFM done to them? These are the people who've been flooded or at flood risk. So residents who've been flooded, businesses who've been flooded. Lots of evidence now showing that it's empowering and beneficial to the health and well-being of flooded communities for them to be involved in some fashion in work to reduce their risk. We also know that of the many other environmental outcomes that ELMs will be supplying, flood risk, possibly alongside access and natural beauty, is likely to be one of the most politically sensitive ones. So local institutions and local councillors, local democracy, will inevitably want to play a key part in deciding what happens on the ground to reduce risk. So what might some of the community involvement look like? Flood groups often like to be involved in some of the key decision making. They might be wanting to engage with some of the landowners, get involved in some of the initial project development, and it will be interesting to see how these elements of local participation and community involvement can be transferred into ELMs. So this won't be particular to flood risk, but as I said, because of this political sensitivity around flood risk and the local sensitivity, this is going to have to be a crucial element of the work. Another key lesson from successful NFM is how they haven't adopted purely kind of methodological or fact-based systems to implement things. They've developed local stories and local narratives, and it's going to be really important that we continue to build on this. So this is a friend of my wife's from Stroud, Adam Horowitz, who was poet in residence with the Pasture Fed Livestock Association, and he's touched upon this in one of his poems. where he says, too much fact runs off busy people like water from compacted soil. Learn how to open them to the seeds of ideas, water them with stories and watch them grow. And I guess my feeling is that COVID-19 has given us this kind of sad opportunity of again telling the story of how our ecosystems and stewardship of the natural environment are inextricably linked to our work, and flood risk is no different. It provides an opportunity for us to develop that narrative and to build upon that as we kind of put things in place with farmers and landowners and communities. Part of that story, I feel, is not overcomplicating natural flood management and the need to balance modelling with learnt experience and work that's occurring on the ground and local knowledge to make that work accessible. And a key part of that is about remembering that natural flood management is a catchment-wide approach. It's a cumulative benefit of these multiple interventions that deliver effective and safe outcomes. So we don't solve flooding with action from a single farm. It's not a project, it's a form of land and watercourse management over the long term. So the final kind of lessons that we can bring from other projects to our work in ELM are that compromise is key. We need to work with partners and with landowners, design measures that fit into their farming practices and their business.
Hi, Chris. Sorry to interrupt you. We've lost your slides.
Yeah, I'll come to the end now. There's only one slide. It's fine. I'm not sure what's happened.
Okay.
possibly my link has gone, but I'm wrapping up now, so it's
okay.
It's not a problem. We need to design and build measures that require little or no maintenance, so that they're easy to look after and easy to manage. We want to build capacity in local contractors, within farmers and within landowners, because we know the benefits of co-ownership and co-design. And we want to remember that this is the cumulative benefit of lots of small interventions. So we want to focus on a dispersed cumulative system of reducing risk, particularly for our slow the flow type approaches, rather than put all our eggs into one or two big bang type of interventions that might be attractive because they store lots of water, but would also be very expensive and difficult to implement. So I will wrap up there at 1:17. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Really interesting. And yeah, we've had quite a lot of questions. Caroline's been busy answering some of them on the chat. A number of questions were also submitted before the webinar. So perhaps if I just ask you a couple of those, and then we can move on to some of those that have been asked during the webinar. So one question was about might it be useful to consider how this may work with salt marsh / mudflats and the incentive for landowners?
The answer to that is absolutely yes. So I know I've talked about flood risk a lot. I did touch upon coastal habitat creation, and this is particularly this kind of this bigger end of nature-based working, where flood granting aid will be needed to do the engineering to perhaps move coastal defences and create the space to allow coastal habitats to recolonise or regenerate. But payments to the landowners or the farmers who are having those changes done to them, or are hopefully part of agreeing to allow those changes to occur, will be absolutely crucial. So those area-based payments, which continue for a long time into the future, are going to be absolutely essential elements of adapting our coasts to sea level rise.
Okay, thank you. Another question, which I know you answered to some extent, but the question is, which role / organisation is the main project manager typically in NFM projects?
So I think up until now, there's been a whole range of organisations involved. And one of the key things that I've been keen to think about, and as now in the EA, as I was when I worked for local authority, is mandate. So who is commissioning or responsible for the flood risk reduction? Is there a responsible authority? So lots of organisations and people are technically equipped to build and put in place natural flood management features. But the key thing is who is kind of directing the need for this flood risk reduction, and are those measures being put into the landscape in the most effective places that are going to be doing that flood risk reduction. So there's this important link between a risk management authority and the people building or doing. I think ELMs changes some of that relationship in a complex way, because although consent and where things should happen will be a big role for risk management authorities, the kind of landowner participation in the scheme might be one of the driving factors in what happens and where it happens on the farm scale. So I think it introduces some complexity into an already complex landscape of organisations. The key thing is who is commissioning and deciding that flood risk reduction works are needed in those particular locations. And I think that still has to be the responsibility or a function that's owned to a certain extent by risk management authorities. If they're unwilling or unable to take responsibility for that, then there's got to be a wider conversation that maybe involves local communities and landowners about putting in place action for themselves.
Thanks, Chris. Another question was how is this information being shared with regional flood and coastal committees as they set up their next 6-year programmes? And perhaps I could link that with another question that came in, if I can scroll down and find it. It was to do with the lead local flood authorities and the extent to which they're being our local authorities and district councils being prepared for an increase in volumes of complexity of land drainage consents and planning applications. I'm not sure if those do actually link together, but
regional flood and coastal committees are being. I gave a very short potted presentation and a paper to every regional flood and coastal committee in England recently, just laying some of the ground for this and asking them to take this work and ELMs into account when they're planning their 6-year programmes. We know that lots of the Environment Agency's area teams are looking much more closely at natural flood management and nature-based working in preparing their 6-year programmes that they'll be submitting to regional flood and coastal committees for decisions. So there is a lot of activity in this area. Whether the local flood authorities and district councils are prepared for the increase in workload, I'm not currently in a position to comment on. I suspect not completely. And the Association Directors of Environment Planning and Transport, ADEPT, have a flood and water management group, and we've suggested recently that ELMs should form a discussion topic at that kind of group to help put in place some kind of preparation for councils in how they might address and engage with ELMs. And there is another link that I want to touch upon very briefly, that is local nature recovery strategies, which will be a function of local authorities. And the current thinking around ELMs is that the spatial prioritisation work will be based upon the local nature recovery strategy priorities. So there will be a significant and complex role for local authorities in determining where some of the activity in ELMs will take place. And I would hope that we could start to develop guidance so that their colleagues working on flood and water management can engage in that process to try and influence where some of the activity within ELMs and local nature recovery will take place.
Thank you. One of the questions asked during the webinar is from Ian Davis, who's let us know that he's a farmer. He said that given that ELMs is meant to provide an income option to all farmers, how do you see the mix between the slow the flow and the larger type schemes? And he's gone on to explain a bit further that he's aware that many farms will have limited opportunity to apply these measures, and the bigger floodplain restoration type projects will generally depend on multiple farmers collaborating to implement them.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure what, well, the income based element. So I guess most people are assuming that tier 1 will be the place where the more straightforward management actions are embedded. So these changes to cropping, livestock management, with hopefully benefits to soils and vegetation that will provide some of these kind of broad scale hydrological benefits. So I think because they'll be more straightforward, universally available, the budget available for tier 1 is likely to be much bigger than that available for the other types of measures. So I think people are viewing tier 1 as being a kind of underpinning or partially contributing to that underpinning income-based system. I think Ian's right. There's more, certainly the floodplain and the more complex actions will require collaboration, and that's a whole other kind of piece of work that is going on somewhere within DEFRA. There are people looking at collaboration and cooperation, and the tier 2 stuff, the kind of smaller scale actions. I think if farms are in these kind of priority catchments where it's going to be beneficial to take action to reduce risk, advisors who are skilled at spotting these opportunities on farms are going to be needed to kind of identify where things can happen. So there's this, I'm probably not explaining it very well, this kind of hierarchy of action from universal things that every farmer can do to slightly more complicated, more niche actions that will take place in these kind of marginal production areas, within drains, within small streams, within kind of less productive areas, and then maybe this kind of larger scale actions that will require significant changes to farm production, because by their very nature they're going to result in permanent changes to land use.
Thank you. Another question, I suppose it's a challenge in a way, about the benefits or the evidence of benefits of NFM. It's a question saying about the operational evidence for slowing the flow at up to 100 kilometres square, up to 20 kilometres square maybe, but after that?
What's the question? What is the evidence?
Yes, really, is the operational evidence for slowing the flow at in larger catchments or larger areas up to 100 kilometres square. I think the questioner says that that maybe there's evidence up to 20 kilometres square, but after that is
well, I agree. It's more difficult. I was basing that assumption upon the output from the Oxford Martin School. So their there the kind of the collation of evidence and expert opinion generally suggests up to about 100 kilometers squared. So that's what I was basing that particular kind of geographical scale on. There is a developing evidence base for from different projects. My own project has seen some reductions in flood risk, but those again are in the smaller end of catchment scale. So yeah, I agree. As you get bigger, the evidence tails off, partially because proportionally and statistically, it's much more difficult to intervene in the proportion of the flow that's needed to get to those flood risk reductions. So it's whether it's just a question of scale of activity, or if there is a real difference between the smaller and bigger catchments, I think is difficult to interpret from the data.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And actually, we've run out of time, so apologies to those people whose questions we didn't get to. But Chris has kindly said that he'll give a written response to the questions he can answer, and
I'll have a go.
Have a go. Yes,
don't expect theses answers.
It's a very broad area, isn't it? So I can't expect you to answer all of them. But yeah, thanks very much, and thanks to Chris for an excellent presentation and some really thorough answers to questions. Thanks to everyone for participating in the questions you've asked. So just if you have got any feedback or follow-up questions, you can get in touch with us at the NFM Research Programme or Chris at the Environment Agency on the via the links below. The recording will be available in the next few days, so do let people who missed out know about it, or listen again. Our next webinar is on the 22nd of October. And it's Katharina Bauer from the South East Rivers Trust, and she'll be talking about monitoring infiltration and retention to support assessment of ecosystem services. So I would urge you, if you're interested in that, sign up soon, as Chris's webinar, this webinar was sold out a couple of weeks before, a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, please do sign up soon, and you can. If you want to find out more about the programme, do sign up to our newsletter, and we'll also, if you do that, we'll let you know about upcoming webinars, which you can also find out about on our website. So thanks again to Chris, thanks again to everyone for joining, and to Caroline for answering questions on the chat, and hopefully you'll join us at our next webinar. So cheerio, goodbye.